Inspire not by perfection, but by congruence. Don't lead from memory, lead from vision. Before a leader ever speaks, before they ever step into a room or onto a stage, something unseen is already at work, a frequency, a signal, an energetic broadcast that emanates from the space between their thoughts and their heartbeat. True leadership doesn't begin with words, titles, or strategies. It begins with the invisible with intention, and not just any intention, but an intention that is coherent, a unified field of thought and emotion aligned toward a single, elevated purpose. Great leaders are not reactive. They do not operate from survival from the noise of urgency, fear, or competition. They operate from creation, and creation is a mental act before it ever becomes physical. In their mind, they have rehearsed the reality they wish to build. They have seen it, felt it, believed it long before the world ever recognizes its shape. They understand that the external world is a reflection of the inner one, and if they are to move people, they must first master the inner environment. This is not fantasy. This is neuroscience. When the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for vision, purpose, and planning, is activated in alignment with the limbic system, the emotional brain, something extraordinary occurs. The body begins to believe the future is happening now. Great leaders live in this space. They don't wait for results to feel empowered. They feel empowered to generate results. They wire their brain to a future vision and rehearse the elevated emotions of that vision so many times that the brain, in its neurochemical reality, cannot distinguish between the imagined and the experienced. This is the beginning of leadership, not in speeches, not in commands, but in silence, in thought, in energy, when the brain and the heart begin to beat in rhythm, when the signal the brain sends matches the emotion the heart broadcasts, the body enters a state of coherence. This coherence becomes a magnetic force, and that force is what people feel when they say, "I don't know what it is about this person, but I'm drawn to them." That's not charisma. That's neurocardiological alignment. That's leadership at its most authentic level. What we fail to understand in the traditional model is that people don't follow ideas, they follow energy. They follow congruence. A leader who walks into a room with scattered thoughts, suppressed emotions, and a fractured sense of purpose will create confusion. But a leader who has done the internal work, who has sat in silence, met themselves in truth, and aligned their mind and heart, becomes a tuning fork for everyone in the room. Others begin to regulate to that field, unconsciously sinking to the frequency of vision, of order, of possibility. This is not about perfection, it's about presence. The coherence of intention creates energetic clarity, and clarity is the soil where trust grows. When a leader's internal signal is aligned, their words gain weight. Their presence demands no attention, it commands respect without force. It's why some leaders can whisper and shift paradigms, while others shout and change nothing. Before any action, there must be awareness. A leader must ask themselves daily, what signal am I sending? What is the emotional signature of my thoughts? Are my words ahead of my energy? Because if they are, people will feel the gap. And it's in that gap between what is said and what is truly felt where trust dies. Authentic leadership, then, becomes less about pushing and more about broadcasting a consistent, coherent field of intention that others can tune into. To lead is to think in elevated ways, to feel in elevated ways, and to act from a place where those two systems, the cognitive and the emotional, are not in conflict, but in sacred cooperation. This is when transformation begins, not in policies or mission statements, but in neurons and heart rhythms. Great leaders build mental models that are expansive, inclusive, and creative. They don't lead from memory, they lead from vision, and because they lead from vision, they give others permission to do the same. Every thought we think creates a chemical. Every emotion we feel creates a vibration. When these two align, they become a transmission, a message that goes beyond language, beyond logic, and straight into the limbic systems of those around us. That's where true change begins, not with persuasion, but with resonance. People begin to believe not because they are told, but because they feel the coherence of belief in the leader's presence. It's in this silent, invisible realm where greatness is first formed. It's in the invisible scaffolding of intention that the architecture of vision is drawn. Great leaders know this. They are not merely problem solvers, they are reality engineers, sculpting outcomes in the quantum field long before results appear on the physical plane. They speak from a place of knowing, not guessing. They stand still in the face of chaos, not because they are fearless, but because their internal compass is steady calibrated, not by ego, but by purpose. So the first act of inspired leadership is inner alignment, not fixing the outer, but mastering the inner, not reacting to noise, but creating signal, not chasing approval, but anchoring into truth. When thought becomes intentional and emotion becomes elevated, when vision becomes vivid and purpose becomes personal, the leader transforms into something far greater than a title or a position. They become a frequency of transformation in human form. In the realm of leadership, information is plentiful. Strategies, charts, projections, and metrics crowd boardrooms and presentations, but information alone does not move people. It does not stir the soul or awaken dormant energy. Great leaders know that while information may educate, it is emotion that transforms. It is emotion that compels people to act, to believe, and to commit beyond reason. When we speak of inspired action, we are speaking of something deeper than compliance. We are speaking of a resonance that occurs when the heart is activated. A leader can deliver facts, but only when those facts are embedded in feeling do they become memorable, influential, and alive. The human brain is not wired to respond to data alone. It is wired to respond to meaning, and meaning is a construct of emotion. We remember how someone made us feel long after we forget what they said. It is the tone, the energy, the presence behind the message that stays imprinted in our nervous system. This is because the emotional centers of the brain, the limbic system, govern behavior far more than the rational centers do. People do not make decisions based on logic. They justify decisions with logic, but they make them based on feeling. A leader who understands this doesn't manipulate emotion, they evoke it consciously, creating an atmosphere where the heart begins to respond before the mind even understands. When a leader communicates from an emotionally elevated state such as passion, conviction, gratitude, or belief, it shifts the energetic field in the room. Emotion is contagious. It is biochemical and electromagnetic. And when a leader speaks from the felt sense of their vision, they activate the mirror neurons in others. These neurons don't just recognize the behavior being modeled, they recreate the emotional state within the observer. The follower doesn't just hear the message, they begin to feel it as their own. This is how belief is transferred. This is how momentum is born. It's not about performance, it's about coherence. A leader who feels deeply aligned with their mission does not need to amplify or exaggerate. The purity of their emotion becomes the fuel for others to connect to something larger than themselves. People are not inspired by what the leader wants them to do. They are inspired by how the leader feels about what they are doing. Emotion bridges the gap between direction and devotion. It turns a vision from abstract into personal. It turns effort into purpose. Neurologically, when someone is emotionally moved, dopamine and norepinephrine surge in the brain, enhancing focus, memory, and motivation. The person becomes more receptive, more engaged, and more likely to take meaningful action. But emotion doesn't just change brain chemistry, it changes identity. When a leader evokes emotion that resonates with a person's deepest values or dreams, that person begins to see themselves differently. They begin to shift their story from "I can't" to "maybe I can," and that subtle shift in identity is what creates massive changes in behavior. In this way, the leader becomes less of a commander and more of an emotional architect, not constructing buildings, but constructing belief systems within people that align with the collective mission. They understand that the energy behind the message is more powerful than the words themselves. A single sentence, charged with genuine emotion, can spark a revolution in consciousness. One moment of authenticity can ripple through an entire culture and reprogram apathy into agency. This is why the most effective leaders do not suppress their emotion, they channel it. They allow themselves to feel deeply, and in doing so, they give others permission to do the same. Vulnerability is not weakness in leadership. It is magnetism. It allows for connection beyond the mental into the field of shared human experience. When a leader shares their story not as a speech, but as a living emotion, it activates trust. And trust is the bridge upon which all action crosses. In a world increasingly saturated with artificial voices and polished messages, what people crave most is something real. Emotion is real. And when a leader speaks from the depths of emotion, they bypass skepticism. The audience doesn't need to be convinced. They are already entrained by the leader's emotional coherence. It becomes less about persuasion and more about transmission. The leader becomes a living example of their own message, and people do not simply follow, they feel compelled to align. A leader who lacks emotion may be technically competent, but they will never inspire. They may produce results, but they will not produce transformation. It is not what they know, but what they feel and how they help others feel that determines their impact. Emotion is the fuel of vision, the carrier wave of belief, and the spark that ignites collective movement. Without it, leadership becomes mechanical. With it, leadership becomes magnetic. The deepest truth is this: people do not rise for objectives, for numbers, or for plans. They rise for a cause, for a story, for a feeling that awakens something dormant inside them. Emotion is the gateway to that awakening. It is not a byproduct of leadership, it is the very heartbeat of it. True leadership does not emerge from maintaining the status quo. It does not reside in comfort zones or in the predictable patterns of yesterday. Great leaders dwell in the realm of the unknown. They stand on the edge of what is familiar and dare to look into the vastness of what could be. This space, the energetic field of possibility, is not just a poetic metaphor. It is a measurable, biological, and quantum reality. The leaders who truly inspire action are those who are willing to break free from the neurological programming of the past and lead themselves and others into the uncharted territory of potential. The human brain is a prediction machine. It seeks patterns, it craves familiarity, and this survival-based design often leads us to recycle the same thoughts, the same emotions, and ultimately the same behaviors, all rooted in the known past. But leaders who inspire do not operate from the past. They refuse to be defined by memory or previous identity. They make a conscious decision to think thoughts they've never thought before, to feel emotions they've never felt before, and to act from a vision rather than a record. In doing so, they alter their energetic signature and step into a state of being that is aligned with the future. This is not wishful thinking. It is neuroplasticity in motion. Every time a leader rehearses a new possibility mentally and emotionally, they begin to rewire their brain to that outcome. They disconnect from the circuitry of fear, doubt, and limitation, and instead fire new networks that reflect courage, vision, and innovation. But thought alone is not enough. It must be combined with an elevated emotional state. The body must be convinced emotionally that the future they envision is not only possible, it's already happening. When thought and emotion align in this way, the body becomes the unconscious mind, and the leader begins to live as if the future is real now. That's when energy begins to shift. That's when others begin to feel the magnetism of possibility. Inspiration flows from leaders who are anchored not in certainty, but in curiosity. They ask questions others are too afraid to ask. They dwell in what some might call the abstract, but what is in fact the space of creation. They see beyond the current conditions and connect to a reality that has not yet materialized. They speak from the future as if it is already here. And because they have mentally and emotionally rehearsed it, they carry the frequency of that vision in every conversation, every meeting, every encounter. It's not what they say, it's what they radiate that moves people. Quantum physics tells us that reality exists in a field of infinite potential until it is observed. In this sense, leaders become the observers who collapse the wave of possibility into a particle of action. They decide what future to emotionally invest in. They set intention with such clarity and belief that the invisible begins to organize around them. Opportunities, people, and synchronicities begin to appear, not by accident, but because the leader is broadcasting a coherent signal that matches the desired reality. They are not waiting for the future, they are drawing it to them through the energy of aligned being. Most people lead from reaction. They look at current circumstances and respond from known emotions, stress, fear, doubt. But visionary leaders invert this model. They lead from the energy of the desired state, not from the energy of the current condition. Even in the face of chaos, they hold steady. Even when the environment offers no evidence of success, they remain emotionally connected to the vision. This emotional consistency becomes their power. It becomes the gravitational force that pulls others out of inertia and into motion. And when others witness this level of internal mastery, something profound happens. They begin to question their own limitations. They begin to feel the stirrings of what is possible for themselves. This is how great leaders inspire action, not by giving instructions, but by embodying the energy of transformation. They become living examples of a different way of being, and in doing so, they awaken others to that same path. The energy of possibility is not chaotic, it is structured, it is intelligent, and it responds to the emotional and mental state of the one engaging with it. When a leader consistently holds a vision that serves something greater than their own ego, when they choose elevated emotional states like love, gratitude, service, and courage, they tap into higher frequencies of creative intelligence. These frequencies bring insight, innovation, and momentum not through force but through flow. To operate in this space requires trust, trust in the unknown, trust in the intelligence that governs life. Trust in the idea that the future is not something to fear, but something to design. This level of leadership transcends management and enters the realm of conscious creation. The leader becomes an instrument through which possibility enters the world not as fantasy, but as structure, systems, culture, and action. This is why great leaders often seem ahead of their time. They are not bound by what is. They are connected to what could be. They sense potential where others see problems. They speak of futures no one else can see, and yet they do so with such conviction that others begin to believe. And belief is the first step toward reality. People begin to rise not because they are told, but because they feel themselves being lifted into a higher possibility. They begin to imagine new versions of themselves. They begin to act in ways that align with that new identity, and that's where movement begins in the unseen, internal shift that is sparked by the energy of a leader who dared to step beyond the known. People don't follow what a leader says, they follow who the leader is. They don't replicate instructions. They replicate identity, and this is the silent force behind every great movement, the unconscious mirroring of being. Strategy may create structure, but identity creates culture. When a leader embodies the values, vision, and energy they speak of, they become a living mirror that reflects possibility back to others. Leadership, then, is not about having all the answers. It's about becoming a reference point for others to remember their own potential. We live in a world obsessed with performance and results, but underneath every outcome is an invisible architecture, the identity of the one creating it. Strategy can be copied, blueprints can be shared, but identity is unique and magnetic. It carries frequency. People might be inspired by a leader's success, but they are transformed by their presence. That presence isn't built in a boardroom. It is shaped in silence, in integrity, in how a leader shows up when no one is watching. Leadership rooted in identity doesn't need to force change. It generates change through resonance. Just as a tuning fork causes other instruments to vibrate in harmony, a coherent leader causes the people around them to elevate not by pushing, but by reflecting a higher standard of being. When a leader is fully aligned, when their thoughts, emotions, and actions are congruent, their team doesn't just hear the mission, they feel the vibration of truth behind it. It's not the message that inspires. It's the embodiment of it. The human brain is wired for imitation. Mirror neurons embedded deep in our nervous system are responsible for our capacity to empathize, to learn through observation, and to adapt to our environment. These neurons don't respond to ideas, they respond to authenticity. A team will unconsciously mirror the energy, beliefs, and emotional patterns of their leader. If the leader is anxious, the team becomes anxious. If the leader is confident, the team begins to stabilize. If the leader leads from fear, control, and scarcity, that energy will ripple through every layer of the organization. But if the leader leads from vision, trust, and presence, then that becomes the energetic blueprint others will instinctively follow. This is why the most powerful transformations do not come from motivation, but from modeling. A leader who models courage in the face of uncertainty grants unspoken permission for others to do the same. A leader who chooses vulnerability over ego shifts the emotional tone of an entire room. People may not consciously understand what's happening, but they feel safer, more open, more aligned. The leader's identity becomes a field of coherence, and within that field, others find clarity within themselves. What's often misunderstood is that people don't change because of what they are told. They change because they are in the presence of someone who reflects their higher self. A great leader doesn't fix people, they reflect back a more expansive version of who that person can become. They hold a mirror to potential, not to limitations. And because identity is contagious, people begin to align with the image being reflected. They start to show up not to impress the leader, but to honor the version of themselves that the leader believes in. This principle dissolves the illusion that leadership is external. It is internal first. The question is not, what should I do to lead better? But rather, who am I being when I lead? Am I embodying what I ask of others? Am I radiating the very energy I wish to see multiplied? Because ultimately, the outer reflects the inner. An organization, a team, a culture, they are all extensions of the leader's state of consciousness. There is a deeper reason why strategy without identity always falls short. When people are forced to adopt behavior that contradicts their internal belief system, there's friction. It might produce short-term results, but not sustainable transformation. But when a leader operates from identity, when they model from the inside out, they bypass resistance. They activate alignment. An action taken from alignment is more powerful than any technique or method. It is soul-fueled action. Leaders who understand the mirror principle stop trying to manage behavior and start shaping energy. They become intentional about how they carry themselves. They take responsibility for the emotional tone they bring into a space. They know that people will rise to meet the frequency they're exposed to, so they elevate that frequency by being fully congruent, by practicing what they preach, by honoring what they expect, and by embodying what they teach. There's no room for hypocrisy in authentic leadership. Any gap between who a leader claims to be and who they are will eventually be mirrored back through disengagement, distrust, or disconnection from the people around them. But when the gap is closed, when a leader becomes the very message they share, transformation happens effortlessly. There's a symbiotic relationship between leader and follower, teacher and student, visionary and builder. Each one becomes a mirror for the other, sharpening, inspiring, reflecting. The culture that emerges from this dynamic is one of deep trust, emotional safety, and shared identity. It's no longer about one person leading many. It's about many becoming leaders within themselves, ignited by the mirror of one. Leadership through identity is not soft, it's not vague, it is powerful, clear, and unwavering. It challenges mediocrity, not by shouting it down, but by outshining it. It calls people up, not by guilt or pressure, but by example. This kind of leadership cannot be faked. It is not built on charisma, but on congruence. And it only emerges when a leader is willing to look in their own mirror first to meet themselves, to align, and to show the world what is possible when a human being becomes a mirror of their highest self. The old paradigm of leadership was built on hierarchy. A single figure stood at the top, issuing commands, making decisions, and expecting compliance. In that model, power was centralized, and people followed out of obligation, fear, or necessity. But as consciousness evolves, so too must our understanding of leadership. The most impactful leaders of today are no longer commanders, they are co-creators. They understand that to truly inspire action, they must move beyond control and step into collaboration born from presence, purpose, and shared identity. The human spirit doesn't thrive under pressure or micromanagement. It expands in environments where it feels seen, valued, and activated. Great leaders don't dictate a path, they invite others into it. They don't just tell people what to do, they awaken something within them that drives them to contribute. This is the essence of conscious collaboration. It's not teamwork by structure. It's teamwork by resonance. And it begins when the leader shifts from being the central source of direction to being a catalyst of collective genius. Co-creation happens in spaces where the leader is not afraid to relinquish control. Not because they are passive, but because they trust in the intelligence of the whole. They know that within every person lies a unique brilliance, a perspective, a gift that the collective cannot reach without their full participation. This kind of leadership is deeply empowering because it recognizes the sacredness of contribution. It doesn't just value outcomes, it values the inner experience of each individual and aligns them toward a vision that transcends individual gain. This shift is more than a leadership tactic. It is a shift in consciousness. A co-creative leader no longer sees themselves as separate from the team. They recognize that they are part of the field, that the energy they bring into every interaction either opens up creative flow or restricts it. They become aware that leadership is not a position to occupy, but a presence to embody. In this space, the need to dominate is replaced by the desire to elevate. The desire to be right is replaced by the willingness to be deeply present and authentically connected. Neuroscience supports this shift. When people feel safe, supported, and seen, their brain transitions out of the survival state, the fight or flight responses governed by the amygdala, and into the prefrontal cortex, the center of creativity, problem-solving, and emotional intelligence. In this elevated brain state, people are more innovative, more cooperative, and more resilient. The co-creative leader understands this not as theory, but as practice. They create environments of psychological safety, where people are not afraid to share, to speak, to experiment, or to fail. Because in that space, growth is natural, innovation becomes inevitable, but co-creation doesn't mean consensus at all costs. It is not about avoiding conflict or diluting vision. It is about cultivating constructive alignment where diverse perspectives are honored without sacrificing clarity. The leader becomes a facilitator of coherence. They don't impose unity, they uncover it by drawing out the core intention that runs beneath the surface of opinions, fears, and egos. In this, the leader becomes not a ruler, but a conductor of energy, attuning each individual into a shared frequency where everyone feels part of something greater. This is where legacy is built, not in what a leader achieves alone, but in what they empower others to build together. The leader's success is no longer measured by personal accolades, but by the depth and authenticity of the collaborative field they create. When people are invited to co-create, they are no longer just working. They are investing their soul into a shared dream. They are not just accountable, they are alive in the process. They rise not because they are required to, but because they want to. The co-creative leader recognizes that true power is distributed. It is not hoarded, it is circulated, and in that circulation energy grows, a culture of trust forms, a rhythm emerges where feedback is not threatening but nourishing. Mistakes are not hidden but learned from. Leadership is no longer a solo act. It becomes a dance between minds, hearts, and intentions moving toward a singular purpose. And it all begins with how the leader listens, not just to words, but to energy. Not just to results, but to alignment. A leader who listens deeply can sense when someone's spirit is disengaged, when someone's contribution is restrained, or when fear has replaced enthusiasm. They don't react, they reconnect. They ask questions that go deeper than performance metrics. They get curious about what lights people up, what holds them back, and what kind of environment would unlock their full expression. This level of leadership demands emotional intelligence, presence, and humility. It asks the leader to see others not as resources, but as creators in their own right. It demands the courage to share space, to invite input, to admit not knowing, and to honor the wisdom in the room. And when this happens, a transformation takes place. The collective field becomes more intelligent than any single mind. Ideas begin to flow with ease. Tensions become doorways to innovation. And work becomes more than just a job, it becomes a vehicle for purpose and elevation. In co-creation, the leader's role is not to shine alone, but to build platforms where others can shine with them, not to impose a vision, but to awaken shared ownership of that vision. This is the new model of leadership, not driven by ego, but by consciousness. Not by dominance, but by presence. Not by instruction, but by invitation to create together. Leadership is not a role, it is a state of being. It does not begin with commands or strategies, but with inner alignment. The leaders who inspire lasting action are those who have mastered the invisible before they ever move into the visible. They think intentionally, feel deeply, and live from a place where mind and heart are in full coherence. They radiate a frequency that others instinctively trust, not because of what they say, but because of who they are. These leaders understand that emotion is not a weakness, it is the engine of transformation. They speak to the soul, not just the intellect. Their message carries weight because it is forged in authenticity, charged with conviction, and delivered through presence. They don't push others into action, they ignite something dormant within them. And in doing so, they awaken purpose, passion, and potential. They don't dwell in the past. They stand in the field of possibility, seeing the future not as a distant hope, but as a living reality waiting to be claimed. Their thoughts create pathways, their emotions create momentum, and their unwavering vision pulls others into belief. They invite their teams not into tasks, but into transformation, not into processes, but into purposeful evolution. Their influence doesn't come from what they demand, it flows from what they embody. They become mirrors that reflect back a higher identity, a version of self that calls people upward, that reminds them of who they truly are beneath fear, doubt, and limitation. In this reflection, people don't just work harder, they rise higher. And above all, great leaders are not builders of empires, they are architects of collaboration. They know that legacy is not what they accomplish alone, but what they empower others to co-create. They move from command to connection, from direction to dialogue, from control to conscious creation. Their leadership becomes a shared frequency, a living ecosystem where energy, ideas, and impact flow freely. This is the kind of leadership the world is hungry for, not louder, not faster, but deeper, grounded in purpose, rooted in identity, charged with emotion, and aligned with a vision far greater than self. When a leader becomes this kind of presence, they don't just inspire action, they awaken a movement.